from the University of Wisconsin in Madison.
Lucas A. Grider-Jones from the McConnell Center at the University of Louisville.
And I am still Alan Walker from East Brunswick High School in East Brunswick, New Jersey. Looking forward to hearing and having you guys start off the second day.
Your names are and your teachers.
Hello, my name is Allie Musgrave, the captain from Unit 1 from Fishers Junior High in Fishers, Indiana.
Hi, I'm Eric Pantula.
Hello, my name is Tegan Majors.
Hi, I'm Allison Van and our teachers are Mr. Ryan Fassold and Mr. Thomas Sturgeon.
Morning. Morning.
Well, question number 2. The doctrine of separation of powers was adopted by the Convention of '87, not to promote efficiency, but to preclude the exercise of arbitrary power. The purpose was not to avoid friction, but to save the people from autocracy. Why did the founders fear the abuse of power? How would you explain the doctrine of separation of powers and what are its major features? How would you differentiate between checking and balancing powers of government? Both checking and balancing important. In what ways can citizens monitor the exercise of power by the government, and how can they act to restrain it even begin?
Montesquieu once said, "It is necessary from the very nature of things that power should be a check to power." The founders feared that power could be abused, so rather than term limits, they provided checks and balances in frequent elections in 2 branches. James Madison expressed his fear of inexperienced representatives in Federalist 53, where he explained that the elected representatives were too new. They were more likely to be deceived. Also, the founders created an impeachment process described by Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 65 and 66. Hamilton names the Senate the court for the trial of impeachments in Federalist 65. The founders feared the abuse of power above all else because they feared the power of the government becoming tyrannical, just like it had in Great Britain.
The doctrine of separation of powers was first introduced by Aristotle with his idea of a mixed government. Montesquieu later expanded on this idea by separating the sword, the purse, and judgment. He organized each branch so that they had sufficient power to check and balance each other. In Federalist 71, Alexander Hamilton writes, "The same rule which teaches the propriety of a partition between the various branches of power teaches us likewise that this partition ought to be so contrived as to render one independent of the other." The War Powers Act is an example of the branches separating power amongst each other. This act states that the President must have consent and a declaration of war from Congress before we take armed forces into conflict. Washington's farewell address, as well as Federalist 68, warn us that if we do not keep the government's powers balanced, then our government will become despotic. Checks and balances help to create a more stable rule of law for the people that consent to the social contract.
Even though checks and balances are used together, there is a fundamental difference. When balancing powers, responsibilities are distributed to different parts of the government. Checking the government is essential when disagreements arise, and the branches check each other to resolve the argument and then make sure the outcome was balanced. Balancing powers is done before anything is enacted. This can be seen in the writing of each article of the Constitution, the checking of powers, and decision in court cases, all which are in place to prevent someone from having too much power. This is shown in the 2012 court case, United States v. Alvarez. In Alvarez, Congress passed the Stolen Valor Act of 2005, which punished those who misrepresented receiving high military honors. In 2013, Congress updated the legislation so it did not infringe upon the rights of free speech and expression. The reason both checking and balancing powers of the government is important is to ensure that the government's power doesn't get out of hand, and establishing checks that all branches have on each other to affirm that anarchy doesn't ensue.
Citizens can monitor the government through press, civic education, civic involvement, through voting, and as a last resort, the Lockean prerogative. The press, the fourth estate, is the watchdog that the government has to look out for, and it speaks to how important and powerful the people are in the system of government. The press is composed of so many people and points of view that collectively they single-handedly stoke the fires that cause polarization in today's modern political climate. Even though the press is divided, their job is to check politicians and the government to protect against tyranny. Aside from the press, ideas like the Lockean prerogative and the right to revolt ensure that if demagogues or tyrants fall into power, that the people have rights to protest the government and overthrow the executive. Another important part of monitoring the power of government is civic education, an important responsibility that the citizens take on to be better educated and aware of actions the government takes on behalf of them. Both of these actions can be enforced and used to monitor the government and limit it through the fear of revolution and protest. We are finished with our testimony and are prepared for follow-up.
let's stay in history a little bit. What were some of the Federalist arguments and the Anti-Federalist arguments over these issues of checking and balancing?
One of the anti-federalist arguments was the Bill of Rights and the idea that the people should have rights before the government should. And that was a compromise that they put into the Federalist Papers and then eventually into the Constitution.
How is that checking or balancing?
It checks the government by giving the people rights that they can't take away. And if one of the rights is taken away, it has to be passed through an amendment and through other things that are needed before they can take those rights away.
The Federalist argument was that we should have a strong federal government, and so they believed that the government should do what's best for the people. However, the Anti-Federalist argument was that the local government would know what is best for the people, and they should also do what's best.
And how is that checking or balancing?
We can see in the original 17th Amendment, or before the 17th Amendment, that senators were elected through state legislators.
And adding on to what Allison said with the 17th Amendment, as you can see, because with the 17th Amendment, they changed the people electing the state legislators, which changed it to a direct democracy, which gave away some of the powers intent of having the states getting more of that power.
Going back to the amendments, the House and the Senate both have to have a 2/3, but then after that, the states have to have a 3/4 vote to pass the amendment.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask maybe a two-part question here, so bear with me. When can you identify, has one branch of government been more important to the people of the United States? And secondly, should one branch be more important to the people?
Right now, you can see that the executive branch is definitely more important to the people of the United States. We are usually the tensions of political arguments are supposed to be in the legislative branch, and today they're forced onto the executive branch.
And I believe that too, but you can see in modern examples too that some of the duties from legislative have been given to executive. And to answer your and so you've seen that modern day examples are given to executive, so that's another reason why I believe that the executive as well is more important.
I don't believe that one branch should be more important to the people, because I feel like people should be civically educated enough to recognize each branch as powerful and see the checks and balances that the founders have laid out.
I agree with Allison because the idea of an independent an independent judiciary is really important to people, not necessarily extremely swaying the judiciary's decision in a court case.
Well, I see what Allison's point is about the people having a civic education to see that all the branches are equal and balanced out. I don't believe that this is presented today, because you can see many times that people aren't civically educated at all, such as polls that show barely anyone knows the modern day is moderately civically educated, such as 27% of people only know the 2016 Democratic president of 2016.
So how much of an onus for the current situation should we place upon the people? So you talked about the situation that the executive seems to be more prevalent. So, and if you deem that to not be a perfect scenario, and that was the sense I got, that you agree that a balance is better, how much responsibility do we place on the people for this situation occurring?
I think that a lot of it falls to the people in power, because as we can see with President Trump, his Twitter is really in the news a lot. He gets his political opinions out on his Twitter page, and a lot of people are up to date and notice that a lot. And I think that the people are seeing that, but it's him that's putting it out. So it's going to be seen either way, but he could have chosen not to, and he still does.
And I feel like this makes the fourth estate, the press, basically what they're saying sway towards what President Trump is saying, and makes the people focus more on.
You can see in Federalist 70 that Hamilton writes about an energetic executive. So some people could believe that President Trump is exercising his right to be energetic.
What if I said, the press is not an effective check and balance, so let's forget the press. Would you be okay with that?
I think definitely not, because the government doesn't necessarily put out news on themselves. there are things like C-SPAN that give videos of the House and things like that, but they don't check themselves through the press. The press can be partisan, but things like the BBC and international news really give the facts of a lot of things that the United States government in and of itself doesn't necessarily give.
It would,
I would have to agree that I would have to say that the press is a sufficient check on the government, and you can see this in court cases such as Rex versus Zanger.
you can also say that, such as like how Great Britain had seditious libel and the people rebelled against that, it causes for the government to become tyrannical.
I want to revisit something I think I heard you said, maybe just to help clarify. When you identified the War Powers Act in your presentation, can you elaborate a little bit more as to whether or not current affairs and current unilateral or executive action, how that factors into your presentation on War Powers Act?
Like we said earlier, we believe that Congress is stripping off some of their duties, and we can see that because there's been no official declaration of war since World War II. However, we have conflicts like some people call the Vietnam War and the Korean War, and we currently have troops deployed in like Afghanistan, Iraq, stuff like that.
All right, thank you. Let's give him a hand.
Okay, like yesterday, we have tons of support and information, which is always something I very much appreciate. Montesquieu, multiple Fed papers, I'm not going to recount them. Hamilton, U.S. versus Alvarez, Washington's farewell speech. And I liked the way you responded to this question. So it was very clear that you had addressed this in the opening statement, and literally took away the question I had set up to ask. So, but in terms of, I think that I may have confused you a little bit with my question, and I wanted to hear a bit more about the role of the people in limiting, for instance, you talked about President Trump. Is the responsibility on the people to do that? And I think that you could have gotten a little deeper into that, okay, in terms of that response to that question. But I think that you handled the other extremely well, and thank you very much.
I'm fascinated when you laid out the citizens' responsibility in that last piece. You phrased it the Lockean prerogative. I'm thinking to myself, yeah, they're talking about the right to a revolution, and yes, you do. Now I find that fascinating that you're willing to entertain the possibility that a check on all of this is let's take it to the streets and blow stuff up. Hopefully that's your last option, not your early option. But I think to a philosophical point, you're right. So that's in the Declaration. So I appreciated you acknowledging that ultimate check. I think on the Federalist, anti-Federalist question, I would have liked a little more on the anti-Federalist fear of blending, and the Federalist being content with blending. That's the way we can check, by blending. They seem to be talking past each other on blending, so I would have liked to urge a bit more on that. But your thought on international press does better than American press. You might be right. So I appreciated that insight. Thank you.
Again, lots of examples and interesting points that you brought up in your presentation. I do also like the drop of the energetic executive in your response. Nice placement. That was a good plug. And again, your support. You always came back to your overall arching theme of the balance is better, and wanted to flesh out more of the idea of what that energetic executive looks like today, so we didn't have time. But again, great presentation, and we enjoyed hearing from you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.